So it's nice to have you here. We're ecstatic, and we're looking forward to your insights. We'll keep it simple to start. You were elected for 35 years. How'd you get here? What happened?
Well, actually, it was all a big mistake. The last thing in the world I ever thought that I would do growing up would be to serve in public office. You're probably aware I've got 11 brothers and sisters, and my dad owned a bar. And I 8 brothers, 3 sisters. I was the second oldest of this clan. And you learn a lot growing up. Matter of fact, I would argue that the lessons I learned growing up were the lessons I needed to do my job. You know, you grew up in a big family, you have to learn to get along with each other, get things done together as a family. You grew up in a bar, you learn a couple of things. One, you have to learn to deal with every jackass that walks in the door. Trust me, that experience helped me a lot when I was Speaker.
Bet it did.
And the other lesson I think I learned growing up in a bar is the art of being able to disagree without being disagreeable. You know, that drunk was going to be sitting there all night if you were attending a bar, and you didn't want to have to fight with this guy all night, but you really didn't have to agree with him. And just because you disagree with someone doesn't make them your enemy. You just disagree with them. So I worked my way through school like a lot of people here, and found myself in a small business in the packaging and plastics industries that I bought and grew it into a successful business. Along the way, I got involved in my neighborhood homeowners association and ended up as Speaker of the House. This too could happen to you. This is the last thing in the world I ever thought I would ever do, but it was a great experience. I was kind of made to do what I was doing, and but I still shake my head at the thought that I served all those years in public office, and ended up as the Speaker of all people.
So I guess the message, if you want to be an aspiring to a political role, the hell with studying poli-sci, go get a job in a bar.
I'll tell you what, you're going to learn a lot more. I was out at Stanford for a speech on their campus about 1.5 years ago. And when you go to these campuses, they expect you to do everything under the sun. And so they sent me to the head of the political science department. Guy had to be 80 years old. To talk to his class. And so I went in, the professor, who, I don't want to say there was disdain on his lips, but he wasn't real happy I was there. And so only encouraged me to be more like me. So I told this class, I said, ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be here. You should all know that I've never taken a political science class in my life, which I hadn't. I still don't know what they teach in a political science class, but you learn a lot more. Frankly, growing up in a bar and growing up in a big family than you'd ever learn in a political science class about how to get along with people, how to get elected, and how to get things done, even with people that you have big disagreements with.
So speaking of getting things done, I mean, the turnover in the White House staff has been near chaotic. In this environment, how do you get anything done?
Well, it's hard. You know, you all saw the election, last year. The only Democrat that Donald Trump could have possibly beaten was Hillary Clinton. And the only Republican that Hillary Clinton could have possibly beat was Donald Trump. We got 330 million Americans. How do we get down to this point? But Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders and I were elected to Congress for the first time together in 1990. The most shocked people last year watching Bernie create a movement were all of us, Democrats and Republicans, who served with him in the Congress, because this old liberal would just walk around with his head hunched down. He didn't talk to anybody. He had no real friends in the Congress. And how he created this movement is beyond me. But understand where we are. Bernie, really. But understand where we are. Over the last, let's go back, let's pick a number, 25 years ago. 25 years ago, there was one radio talk show host in America that not many people had heard of. Today, there are thousands of them spewing all kinds of nonsense. 25 years ago, there was one cable news channel that just did news. Now we've got a dozen of them, and all they do are politics all day long, put all these people on TV who are experts, who don't know anything about anything, but it doesn't mean they don't talk. 25 years ago, there was an internet, but only a couple of geeks in Palo Alto were using it. Now everybody's connected to the internet. Everybody's got these giant email lists. You can create your own organization overnight. And on the top of that, you've got Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn, get down the whole long list. And what's happened is the American people have been deluged with information. Most of it accurate, but not all of it. You know, there's this one internet myth that members of Congress get their salary for life. Well, if I was going to get my salary for life, why wouldn't I quit after the first day? All right? I was going to spend 25 years there. You'd think somebody would figure out this is really not true. I went to a golf event a couple of months ago, and one of my neighbors came up to me and said, "Wow," he says, "you look okay." I said, "Well, yeah, I feel fine." He said, "Some friend of mine sent me an article last night that said you were on your deathbed, that you were dying of brain cancer and lung cancer, and that you decided to do a 3-hour interview on your deathbed with a Washington Post that's embargoed until you die, and you throw Paul Ryan under the bus." Oh, really? You can't even make this stuff up. My point is, people have been deluged with information. 100 times, 200 times more information than they had 25 years ago. And all this information has tended to push or pull people into one of two camps, leaving fewer and fewer people in the middle. And so this vortex is out there. Who shows up in the primary? The left of the left and the right of the right. And so when you look at what's going on right now, you know, Chuck Schumer would probably love to cut a deal on taxes. But Chuck Schumer is the relatively new leader over in the Democrat caucus in the Senate. And he's got Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are kind of controlling where the Democrat Party is. So Schumer can't really work with Republicans without them taking his head off. And then you got the same problem on the right. You know, while there's a way to get to a bipartisan tax bill or a bipartisan way to fix Obamacare, you know, poor Paul Ryan, if he goes down that path, he's going to have those members on him, the far right members, the knuckleheads. They're going to be on him like white on rice. And so when you watch what's happening, just remember this vortex we're in. It's what's caused the gridlock in the Congress. It's what caused, frankly, the election of Donald Trump. And you turn the news on, which I can't do. I turn the news on for about 10 minutes. And then I'm about to throw up. So I turn on the Weather Channel. You know why? Because it's just the weather.
So let's stay in that. What about the knuckleheads?
The knuckleheads. You know, there's about 30 of them in the House Republican Conference. God bless them. They're nice enough people, but, you know, I don't know why they're there. They just vote no. You know, if you vote no, which is easy to do, you're not responsible for anything. And so, you know, I used to go to them because every once in a while I thought they had a good idea. I would adopt their idea. I'd take it to the conference. We're all ready to go. And then all of a sudden, they all go south. Wasn't good enough. Well, it was your idea. But I call them anarchists because they're really there for total chaos. And, you know, I didn't go there to be a congressman. I surely didn't go there to be speaker. I went there to do something on behalf of our country. And sometimes I wonder, you know, why some of these members are there on the far left and far right, because it seems like they're there just to make noise.
So you've obviously given us some good insight about Mr. Sanders. There were a whole bunch of candidates on the Republican side that started.
You mean the race for president?
Yes. Who was your least favorite? I think you called him Lucifer.
Well, there was a guy from Texas who I referred to as Lucifer in the flesh. Because he is, all right? There are a lot of great candidates, but except one, all right? So I'm back at Stanford a year and a half ago, and this professor is doing an interview after I give a speech, and he's trying to really make me say that I'll vote for Donald Trump. So he's pressing me. We still have all these candidates. I said, listen, if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, I'm going to vote for him. Wasn't an hour later, my phone rings. Hey, Boehner, Trump, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I said, Donald, listen, you probably know you weren't my first choice. No, I know. That's okay. That's okay. I said, no, Donald, you weren't my second or my third choice either. I said, but you're going to be the nominee, and I'm going to vote for you.
So who did you really want?
I was a Jeb Bush guy. I could have been a John Kasich guy, but they weren't crazy enough to win in the environment that we had in the election cycle last time.
So when you look at a Bush and a Kasich, but especially Bush, why couldn't he get any traction?
Because he wasn't crazy enough. You know, there were about a half a dozen of them that were mainstream Republicans, solid. But that's not what the Republican voters wanted. They wanted something more radical. Just like on the Democrat side. You know, Hillary Clinton thought she was going to be crowned as their nominee in 2008. And this upstart from Illinois who just showed up in the Senate, and I don't think he'd even voted yet. He was already running for president, runs circles around her. And so, you know, she thinks she's going to get crowned in 2016. And then this crazy man, Bernie Sanders, jumps up and really causes her all kinds of grief. And so it just, again, go back to the vortex that this election occurred in. What's going on now in the White House, what's going on now in the Congress is also caught up in this same vortex.
But given we got this vortex and we got a country to run, can we ever get any legislation that makes sense passed?
Well, Donald Trump is learning to be president. And the first thing that all of these people who've been president learn is that when you're president, you really don't have much power. You know, you've got control over what you do on the foreign policy side, by and large. You know, you can kind of manage the Pentagon. You've got some leeway there. But everything else requires Congress to pass a piece of legislation. If you want to spend a dime, the Congress has to appropriate the money. And so they all figure out sooner or later that, we got to work with these guys up on Capitol Hill. So what is Capitol Hill, House and Senate? It's a committee of 535 people. Has anybody ever seen a committee of 535 people accomplish anything? No. But this is exactly what the founders had in mind when they created this. They knew that the country would grow. They knew that Congress would grow. And they knew that Congress would never be able to agree on much, which was their whole vision of a limited federal government. You know, back then it was all about the states. And the federal government was only going to be there to really serve as some confederation. And so that's why not a whole lot gets done. But having watched this early in my career, I always thought it was really important that the leaders be able to trust each other and work with each other, because if they didn't, nothing would ever happen. And so, you know, while I didn't have a whole lot in agreement with Barack Obama, you know, I had to work with him. The American people didn't care whether he was a Democrat and I was a Republican. They looked at us and said, "You figure it out." And I never thought the word compromise was the right word. I thought seeking common ground was, because there are places I knew the president couldn't go, and the president knew there were places I couldn't go. But on behalf of the American people, what can you do? You know, I didn't agree with Harry Reid. You know, I always thought he had a face for radio. You know, Harry used to be a boxer, spent an awful lot of rounds in a ring with not enough padding in the gloves. But let me tell you something. When you cut a deal with Harry Reid, it was a deal. And Harry and I developed a very close relationship. As a matter of fact, we're still close friends today. even though we don't agree on a whole lot. He was a great guy to work with. For that matter, Nancy Pelosi and I don't agree on a whole lot. But you put her at the table and you cut a deal, she would deliver the votes. And so it's really important for the leaders to be able to have these kind of relationships so that they can do what they have to do in order to get anything done.
So much has been made about Barack Obama and you and deals that didn't quite come out perfectly. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, yes. Like I said, the president, he was a dyed-in-the-wool lefty, and really hadn't spent much time in Washington, and really didn't understand the process very well, and thought he could do more with his pen and his phone than he could working with the Congress, and the Obama White House was not very well organized, and every White House other than them have a big outreach operation to the Congress and a legislative affairs shop that works with all the members of Congress, both parties. Every member's got issues. They got somebody that's going to have a 100th birthday in your district and they want a letter from the president. But the Obama administration had almost no outreach to the Hill. It was so bad that it wasn't just Republicans, it was the Democrats too. And so there wasn't a whole lot of strong goodwill between the Congress and the Obama administration. But back in 2011, when we were trying to do a big debt deal, I got accused of, pushing the debt limit and the funding of the government to the limit. I think it was July the 3rd, I was meeting with President Obama. He called me that Sunday morning, and I was in Portland, Maine. He was up at Camp David and said, "Boehner, we got to get together tonight." I said, "Mr. President, I can't. I've got 15 of my high school football buddies in town. Their spouses. We're having dinner." No, we've got to talk. So I pushed the dinner back, and I go down and sneak into the White House because I couldn't just walk in. The press would go crazy on the left and the right. And so the president wanted to sit in the Oval Office and have this chat. I said, "Come on, Mr. President, I want to go outside on that patio that Reagan built out here." So we go out there, it's 95 degrees, 95% humidity. But I've got my red wine, I've got a cigarette, and somewhere through this meeting, I look across the table at the president, who's got he's got a glass of iced tea, and he's chomping on Nicorette. What else do you want to know about the two of us? But when I announced my retirement, the first phone call I got was from one of my best friends, George W. Bush. "Boehner, get your rear end down here to Texas. I'm going to whip you on the golf course." That's the cleaned up version of what he said. I won't tell you what I said. The second phone call I get is from President Obama. "Hey, Boehner, man, you can't do this. We got to get this done. We got to get this done. We got to get this done. We got to get this done." And he's going on and on. "We got to do something about the debt ceiling. We got to do something about the budget." And finally he pauses and he says, "Boehner, man, I'm going to miss you." I said, "Mr. President, yes, you are." While I had a relationship with him, and I had a good relationship with him in spite of all the obstacles and the press and the noise and the fact that I had to give speeches, he had to give speeches, he had to say rotten things about me. I tried not to say rotten things about him. But it was, frankly, quite an experience.
So you mentioned George W., and, he kind of got a lot of bad press. People didn't always take him as seriously as, I'll say, as well read as some of his predecessors, but others tell me it's quite the contrary. What's your take?
Well, I met George W. Bush when I was first elected to Congress in 1990. His dad was president. And got to know him even better when he was running for governor of Texas and serving as governor. And so I kind of lived through every day of his 8 years as president. And I have to tell you, he's a smart guy, a driven guy, and I watched him take all kinds of political hits because he just decided he was going to do what he thought was in the best interest of the country every day, regardless of how much noise it was going to make. And he had some tough days, some really tough days. But a good man and a good leader, and had really one whale of an operation, especially considering the issues that he had to deal with.
So far, the Republicans control the House, but we've had no real wins. What's it going to take for Ryan to cobble together something for a win?
Well, they have to get a win. They promised the American people that they would repeal and replace Obamacare, that they'd do something on infrastructure, and they would overhaul the tax code. So, haven't gotten any success on the Obamacare front yet. Nothing on the horizon on infrastructure because they don't have a way to pay for it. And so tax reform is the 800-pound gorilla. And they know. I've been watching this over the last few months. I knew it was going to happen, that you get to a point of desperation. You know, typically I thought tax reform probably a 1 in 4 chance. But now that we're in this period of desperation, they are so desperate to get something done, it'll help push the members together. And so, I'd say the odds are approaching 50-50 that we'll get a tax bill. I mean, all we've seen so far is a 2-page press release. We haven't seen any details. And trust me, when the details start to show up, people are going to be throwing up all over themselves. Because there are going to be winners and there's going to be losers. That's why we haven't done this in the last 30 years. But it needs to be done. But the border adjustable tax, Paul Ryan's big idea, gone. The deduction for state and local income taxes that they wanted to get rid of, well, that's politically impossible to do. Repealing and replacing Obamacare was going to get rid of all the Obamacare taxes, which would have created a $1.3 trillion headroom over 10 years in the congressional budget revenue baseline. So when you lose roughly $3.5 trillion of money that you were going to use to bring down rates and simplify the code, it's made it a lot harder. And so they've had to start looking under rocks, trying to find pay-fors so that they don't explode the budget deficit. And, people like yourselves in the insurance industry, where, if I'm correct, there's 22 separate areas in the tax code where some would argue you benefit from. Trust me, they're dusting off every one of them, trying to figure out how they're going to get the revenue to do what they want to do. But I don't think they can, there's just not enough revenue and other sources to do the things they really want to do. So I don't think the corporate tax rate certainly is not going to get to 15. I don't see how they get to 20. They may get to 22.5, but I think that's about as far as they can probably go. And on the individual side, I don't think they can do much with the top rate. We're going to see more simplification here. Instead of 6 different brackets, I think we're going to have 3 maximum brackets. And but at some point, somebody's got to pay taxes. And when you look at, I'll give you an example. What do you think the average family in America, middle-class family that makes, let's say, adjusted gross income of $75,000 to $200,000? What do you think their effective federal tax rate is?
Probably pretty low. 8%?
He's doing his homework. It's 8.6%. Because, these are the people who use the home mortgage interest deduction. These are the people who use the child tax credit, the state and local income tax deduction. And so, this is the great big bulk of America. And at some point, somebody's got to pay the taxes. And so because they can't get rid of the deduction for state and local income taxes, my guess is they'll keep the deduction. But as your income rises, there will be a cap on how much you can actually deduct from your income taxes. Because people won't realize this until a year later when they file their return. It's kind of a sneaky way to do it, but I've seen it done before.
Where else will they kick some cans down the road, or kind of like phase things in so we don't feel it, but it adds to the math?
Well, there'd probably be some issues where they can't do it all at one time because the votes aren't there. You take the whole solar energy tax credit. You know, the whole solar energy thing, it may be good for the environment, but it sure isn't good for the taxpayers. And none of that stuff would have been built if it weren't for the tax credits and tax deductions that they get to do this. And so it makes no economic sense to do it. But chopping it off at the knees probably isn't going to happen. But a 5-year phase out or phase down of those credits, I think it'd be, my guess is that'll happen.
So obviously, to your point about the 22 provisions, a lot of folks in this room are worried about how we're going to come out of it. What's your advice to them or to their government affairs people about what they should be saying, doing?
Well, get to know the member of Congress that represents your offices, especially your main office, but all your offices. And whether it's the House member or the 2 senators in your state, develop a relationship with these people. I mean, they're just regular people who happen to be in a different business, and get to know them. Make sure they understand your issues. Everybody comes to my office. Used to come to my office. You know, they were bringing information, educating me about the issue that was important to them. And sometimes you'd have people on both sides of an issue. And then you'd really find out who was doing what to who. But educating the members is critically important. And, you know, and if you're based in that member's district, you can vote for them, you can vote against them. You can support their election, you can support their opponent. So your voice is a lot louder and more important when you're talking to your own member of Congress that represents you or represents the company.
So I'm going to switch gears for a minute. We'll go from tax to what do you make about...
How about anything?
What do you make about all this NFL uproar?
Well, you know, I don't think it's right. I think you should stand for the flag. The president didn't really need to get in the middle of this. But if you watch the president, every couple of weeks, he'll throw some red meat at his base. And that's exactly what this was. This was, you know, he cut this deal with Pelosi and Schumer on funding the government through into December and dealing with the debt limit and pushing it off until December. Thought he was being helpful, and probably afraid that his base was getting a little soft. And so, you know, he had to throw a little red meat at him, which all that did was create 2 more weeks of noise. But this too shall pass.
But do you see any abatement in the constant throwing of red meat that constantly keeps us in this cycling?
Well, I would do it differently. You know, I just don't understand why he has to tweet as much, but he does. And I'm sure his family's talked to him. I'm sure his staff has talked to him. I've tried to talk to him. But, you know, it's hard to talk to somebody that doesn't have any ears.
So you don't think that's going to change anytime soon?
Listen, if you watch the last 12 months of the election cycle, why would anybody think the first 12 months of the Trump presidency would be any different? It's not. This is the most unusual president we've ever had. Sometimes controversial, sometimes divisive, and also sometimes effective. And what's really kind of interesting here is that from a Republican perspective, if you look at the things that the administration are doing, I couldn't be happier. all the deregulatory issues that they're dealing with, whether it's EPA, Department of Labor, the fiduciary rule. You get on the whole long list on the deregulatory side, it's all good stuff. If you look at the foreign policy side, he's doing all the right things. Our allies are just thrilled to death in the Middle East and over in Asia. So taking on ISIS, doing well with ISIS. But the president's tweets get in the way of the successes that he's having. If I can help him grow a set of ears, I would help him understand that you're doing good things. The country are happy about these things. But when you start tweeting about Bob Corker getting in a fight with Mitch McConnell or Bob Corker, or next week it'll be Paul Ryan again, or doing this NFL business, it just gets in the way of the good work that you're actually doing.
But that brings up a question. You'd read certain things would suggest he's egotistical, he's narcissistic. I'm not judging. I'm simply pointing out what some say. But here's my question.
You expect me to answer this question?
Well, I didn't actually get to it yet.
Well, that's what I was afraid of.
So he is doing things that frankly Republicans could rally around, could be proud of, but he keeps blocking them out with all this other stuff. Why?
Well, he's Donald Trump. You got a CEO who's never been in an elected office, a CEO that was always used to calling the shots and doing it his way, whether you like it or not. And so now he's the president. He thinks he can call the shots, but presidents have limited power. And he would probably argue that his tweeting was the key to his elections. And so he thinks tweeting is the key to his presidency. I would disagree. Listen, I know Donald Trump. I've played a lot of golf with him over the years. He was one of my donors. When I was speaker, if I was having a rough week, inevitably, he would call, pat me on the back, cheer me up. He's a great guy. But president? Really? I mean, I never saw him as president. But the man got elected. He beat 15 pretty good Republican candidates. He beat Hillary Clinton. And he's the president. But it's going to be a little different. Real different.
So, ACA, we got to go there, right?
You mean Obamacare? Affordable Care Act, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I didn't want to use those words.
That's all right.
But
all right.
Obamacare.
Make sure everybody else in the audience understood what you were talking about.
Obamacare, does any of it work? What works? Where's it going? What's your view?
Well, what works are providing subsidies to what I would call the working poor. They expanded Medicaid probably much further than I would have. So if you make up to 400% of poverty, you're covered by the government. It's not much coverage in my view. You really can't go see a doctor because they don't take Medicaid patients. You just show up at the emergency room. So I'm not quite sure I would do it that way. But the subsidies for the working poor to be able to buy health insurance, smart idea. But when you look at Obamacare, it wasn't just the health insurance business they took control of. They took control of the whole health care delivery system. All the rules, regulations, everything driven by Washington. The one thing that I've learned over the years is that a one-size-fits-all policy does not work in the United States of America. We are a wide, diverse country with diverse people. That's why we have 50 states who understand their people a whole lot better than Washington. And when you look at Obamacare, there are some 35 exceptions to the enrollment deadline, which basically means you don't have to enroll until you're sick. And so the whole thing is built on a house of cards. Not going to work. Now, what Republicans could do is get rid of the employer mandate, get rid of the individual mandate, empower consumers, empower the states. There are a lot of things they can do to fix the framework that's there that makes it, I think, much more consumer-friendly and much more practical. But you just can't repeal it outright because it's been around too long. People get used to this entitlement. whether it's the people who are on Medicaid, whether the people getting the subsidies. You just can't repeal it. So in February, I was giving a speech in front of 8,500 healthcare professionals. I should have known the press was there when I said they're not going to repeal and replace Obamacare. They're going to repair it. And you know, the world, I'm not in the news-making business anymore. Oh, my God. There were headlines everywhere. And I told them what the fix would look like, which I just described to all of you. Of course, none of that made it into the articles. So there were a lot of upset people. President, Paul Ryan, text, gee, thanks. And so when this whole thing blew up in early August, I must have had 100 press calls wanting me to take a victory lap. I don't want to take a victory lap. I want them to succeed. But they haven't succeeded yet.
Do you see any hope that there will be a change in the next year or two?
Oh, well, there has to be with regard to the Affordable Care Act. Otherwise, there will be no insurers in the marketplace next year. This is cratering. Everybody knows it, Democrats, Republicans. But they try to do a partisan bill. And it's just hard to do. And so there are bipartisan fixes out there that can repair this in a way that will make it workable.
So people talk about, Trump, the art of the deal. Did he, do you think, cut off the subsidies intentionally to get people to force them to talk? Or?
Well, no. The cost-sharing subsidies that he stopped have never been authorized or funded by the Congress. I filed suit against the Obama administration because they were making all those payments, but there was no authorization. There was no appropriation. It was clearly in violation of the Constitution. And some judge, federal judge, upheld my lawsuit several times. It's still in the D.C. Circuit Court. So what Trump did was say, listen, you give me the money, I'll pay them. But I don't have the money. And so what he's doing is forcing Congress to act, which is the same thing he's doing with the deferred action for immigrant children. He's keeping his campaign promise. He was going to stop it, but he's pushing Congress to fix it. Nobody wants to send those kids home. Well, Steve King from Iowa and a few other knuckleheads, but he's trying to force Congress to do what they have to do.
So when you think about it, though, at some point, if he keeps doing things that he's doing, does the Republican Party have to go to war with the president?
Well, remember, Donald Trump is not a Republican. He's not a Democrat. He's a populist who happened to get elected as a Republican. And so it's not the Republican Party and the president, it's the Congress. And at some point, they're going to have to find some way to have a better relationship.
But do you think the voters, clearly the Democrats are having a field day. Do the voters make that differentiation you just did? And what happens in the midterms?
Well, if the Republicans don't deliver on at least tax reform, that's the big one. If they get tax reform done, they've got a fighting chance to hold the majority. Listen, 2018 was never going to be a good Republican year. Donald Trump won the White House in 2016 as a Republican. 2 years later, the party out of power always does better. Always. The average number of seats traded is 32. And we've got about a 30-seat majority, or 27-seat majority Republicans in the House. And so it was never going to be good. But if they don't deliver on what they promised, remember, elections are won and lost based on who shows up to vote. I said this last year when it came to the Trump-Clinton race for the White House. And I would tell people I thought that the odds were 55-45 that Hillary would win. I said, but don't think that Donald Trump can't win, because you never know who's going to show up and vote. They can kind of model who they think is going to show up, but they don't know. And when you looked at the election, what happened? More of Trump's people showed up. Then Hillary's people, a lot of them, stayed home. I was in my first race for Congress in 1990. And the first thing you have to know when you're running for office is that if people can't say your name, they're not going to vote for you. You know, my name looks like Boehner, Boehner. And I'm running against an incumbent who's in trouble. He's not going to win. But I'm running against his former member of Congress who ran for the Senate, lost. He was a lobbyist in D.C., wasn't going well, needed his job back. His name was Tom Kindness. Kindness. Against Boehner. I never had a poll showing me within 80 points of winning. My staff lied to me for a year. And I worked my tail off 24/7 for a year in this primary, not knowing that I had no chance to win. Well, my opponent did nothing because he kept looking at the same polls I was looking at. He had an 80-point lead. He didn't have to do anything. Well, guess what? Election night came, and I won big because I turned my voters out. You know, not the same group of people show up and vote every time. And I turned all these people out, and the guy had to have been totally shocked. So remember, polls don't decide elections, voters do.
But if I take that logic and think about how the left is mobilizing around all that Trump's doing, doesn't that even kind of say it's going to be worse for Republicans?
So when you look at 2018, you can bet that every real Democrat's going to show up and vote against the Republican because, you know, the antipathy toward Republicans and Trump especially will drive them out. But if Republicans don't deliver, well, why would Republican voters show up and vote for them? And that's the issue. That's the problem. That's why they have to deliver. They've got to give people, Republicans, a reason to show up and vote in the next election.
So back to international, we'll switch there for a minute. Are we heading toward World War III?
Well, I give Donald Trump an awful lot of credit for taking on the problem in North Korea and sticking to it. You know, I've watched this issue for 30 years. I've watched presidents deal with this issue, and it gets lip service for a couple of months, and then it just goes away. And this guy's a real problem. I mean, a real problem. And so I appreciate the president's focus on this. He's made it clear to the Chinese. Listen, you take care of this problem. I'll never say another word about your manipulating your currency. I'll solve these little trade problems we have. But, you know, the president gave them 2 weeks, and they start dumping on the Chinese again. The Chinese will take care of this. They need to do it their way. The Chinese want no chaos on the Korean Peninsula. They like having this protection on their border. They certainly don't want to see the U.S. on the peninsula in a big way. So they've got lots of reasons to deal with this. And I think the Chinese are the only ones capable of dealing with UN. But this guy is irrational, illogical, and he could do anything. So while I appreciate the president's focus on it, I'm not sure all these tweets are going to help because this guy's nuts. I'm talking about UN now.
I wanted you to clarify.
He's nuts. And, you know, he's capable of doing anything. So, but I'll have to tell you this. I was in Seoul, Korea about 2 weeks ago. I was there for 3 days of meetings, and this issue came up one time in 3 days. They're kind of used to it. So I hope it gets resolved once and for all, though.
So every couple of days, Robert Mueller's name comes back up or something comes out. What do you make of that? And they're going to find enough evidence?
Well,
you're a lawyer, after all.
I am not a lawyer. I was in the packaging and plastics business. I was just around a lot of lawyers over 35 years. Mueller is doing a criminal investigation with regard to Russia's meddling in our election. The House and Senate Intelligence Committees are doing an investigation. which I will call it a political investigation. And so I don't know what Mueller's up to. Clearly, I think there are some people who've got problems. You know, you read about Flynn, Michael Flynn, and Paul Manafort. These guys have had some dealings. I think there's some people on the Democrat side who, you know, were unmasking names that may have a problem. But nobody's suggesting the president was involved in this at all. But on the House and Senate Intelligence Committee investigations, they're basically, I would break this into three buckets. What were the campaigns, what were the Russians trying to do? What did they do, and did it have any effect on the election? Secondly, why were both campaigns talking to the Russians? Now, I don't talk to the Russians. Putin put me on the no-fly list of Russia because he got tired of me calling him a thug. And I called him a thug because he is. So I'm on the no-fly list of Russia, so Russians don't talk to me.
So there isn't a picture of him somewhere in your house with his shirt off, huh?
No, I don't think so. But both campaigns were talking to the Russians during the campaign. Why? Well, I think people, I don't know. And then thirdly, the third bucket, what happened during the transition, starting the day after the election? There's clearly some Trump campaign types or people around them that were talking to the Russians. And so Mueller will get us, we'll see what happens on the criminal side, but I think we'll learn much more about what really went on when the House and Senate produced their reports. Now, I've urged both of the chairmen, happen to both be friends of mine, they have to have a bipartisan report. Because if it's a partisan report, Republicans say X, Democrats say Y, nobody really learns anything. And to the extent it's a bipartisan report, it can really help inform the public as to what really happened and, frankly, what didn't happen.
So our industry cares a lot about secure retirements and how Americans save. What do you think Congress should be doing to help support better savings habits?
Well, I was the author of the Pension Protection Act, big believer in investment advice. We've so protected the American people that the only place they can get investment advice is from Bob at the coffee shop. It's pathetic. And we have a retirement crisis. We've had one coming at us for some time. And so having incentives for people to save for their retirement are really good things. That's why they're in the tax code. There was some suggestion they may cap just how much can be put away in a 401k. The president cut everybody's legs off, saying we're not going to change it. Thanks, Mr. President. But you all be thanking him, President. But it's really important. And, you know, you got a lot of baby boomers like me who are still working because they have to. And in a way, that helps our economy. But I don't know that people have the kind of retirement freedom that most of us would like to have.
So we do have a lot of actuaries in the room. So as you think about the numbers that I know you know about Medicare, where that's going in expenses, the deficit, are we ever going to be able to take on any of those issues that really matter?
Well, we have to. You can't keep spending money that you don't have in your own personal budget. Your company can't do it, and your government can't do it either. And you know, I've watched this debt explode. When I was Speaker for 5 years, it was really economic growth and deficit reduction were the two biggest issues and priorities for me. And you know, I got a $2 trillion deficit reduction deal out of the president to extend the debt ceiling. Now, it was an inartful way to cut $2 trillion, but damn it, we cut it. Nancy Pelosi and I were trying to fix the payment system for how we pay doctors for Medicaid patients. And we came up with three little changes to Medicare, which the Congressional Budget Office told us initially would save $200 billion $200 billion over 10 years. Well, 6 months later, they come along and say, well, actually, these three little changes over the next 25 years will save $3 trillion. Now, that's real money. Now, there are more savings, and nobody's even going to notice these three little changes that we made. There are more changes that need to be made. Social Security, it's real easy. They're just dials. Raise the amount of earnings subject to Social Security taxes, move the retirement age out. Same thing but ought to happen, frankly, for Medicare. And so Social Security is easy. But when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare and this whole health care issue, it's far harder. We spend all this time focusing on health insurance and how to get people insured. And there's almost no focus in our country on how we deliver health care. Now, by and large, we deliver the best health care of any place in the world. But the way we do it and the way we pay for it is ridiculously inefficient and expensive. But nobody really wants to focus on this. And at some point, if we don't begin to focus on it, it's going to just continue to eat up money that we don't have.
As you think about the next 4, 8 years, future of our country, where are we heading? What's your predictions?
Well, I'm a big believer in America. I was born an optimist. Of course, I'd have never gotten very far if I hadn't been born an optimist. But I was born with the glass half full. I think we live in the greatest country in the world. Winston Churchill, back at the beginning of World War II, he said, Americans will make every bad decision that you can think of until they get it right. And we're the most resilient people that God ever put on earth. And so I'm a big believer in America. You can rise as far as you want. You can do as much as you want, accomplish as much. It's the only country in the world I know that you can grow up the son of a bartender and end up as the Speaker of the House.
So, as you look back at an incredible career, what are a couple of the political highlights of your career? What sticks out?
Well, we talked about the deficit reduction, and we talked about the Medicare deal, and I can go through a bunch of legislative accomplishments, but I mentioned two things. The most rewarding part of serving in public office, and while we got to put our fingerprints on a lot of big legislation in the future of the country, the most rewarding thing about being in office is you meet a lot of people you would have never met but for the fact that you ran for public office. My little community where I live, we've got about 60,000 people. When I first ran for office as president of our homeowners association, I ended up running for township trustee. We had about 25,000 people, and I knocked on every door in our township. Well, you meet a lot of people who are still, a lot of them, friends of mine today. Then I get a state rep district, congressional district. I got 750,000 people that live in my congressional district, and I've met tens of thousands of them over the last 25 years. And you just learn a lot about people and their challenges, their successes. Well, then I was the Republican leader for 10 years, and I traveled from one coast to the other nonstop, raising money for the party, raising money for members. And I met tens of thousands of people from one coast to the other. And it's just, you meet a lot of really, really interesting people. Harry Truman said that in Washington, if you want a friend, get a dog. Well, let me tell you what, Harry Truman was wrong. I've got 3 still best friends. Tom Latham, a member of Congress from Iowa. Saxby Chambliss, former senator, former House member from Georgia, both retired like me. And then Richard Burr from North Carolina, now a senator, former House member. But the 4 of us were kind of inseparable. And we go on vacations together and travel with our spouses. But I've got, thousands of friends here in D.C. on both sides of the aisle. And I have to tell you, it's the people that make this worthwhile. But I think, you're not trying to get me to cry, are you? It's not real hard to do. But I guess the thing that I look back on the most, that was the most thrilling, was having Pope John Paul come. In 1995, I was a young member of the Republican leadership. We had just earned the majority for the first time in 40 years. And I realized that we'd never had a pope address a joint session of Congress. And so I sent Pope John Paul a letter, heard nothing. And, 3 or 4 or 5 years later, Pope Benedict gets elevated. I send him a letter, nothing. Came to Washington, went to the White House. I saw him there, but I didn't come to Capitol Hill. So when Francis got elevated in 2014, I sent him a letter. And of course, I didn't hear much. And so about 9 months later, Cardinal Wuerl, the Archbishop of Washington, was in the Vatican trying to convince the Pope to come to the U.S. And the Pope told Cardinal Wuerl, no, Cardinal, I'm going here, I'm going here, I'm going here, and here. I'm not coming to the U.S. in 2015. And he said, but I got this letter from your parliament. I'm somewhat intrigued by it. And so Cardinal Wuerl says, well, your Holy Father, in the U.S., it's our Congress. And the guy that wrote the letter is a guy named John Boehner, who does all these things for our kids here in D.C. And so he told the Pope all about me. And so the Pope looks at him and said, okay, I'll come. And so a couple weeks later, there's a date. He's coming on September 24th, 2015. And it turns out my daughter's pregnant with my first grandchild. Going to be born 6 weeks before the Pope comes. So Cardinal Wuerl, Cardinal Dolan of New York, one of my buds, they start working the Vatican over to get the Pope to baptize my grandson. Now you have to remember the Vatican has a 2,000-year head start on bureaucracy. They are really good at this. So finally, after months of haggling, the Vatican comes back and says, listen, we'd be happy to have the Pope bless your grandson. Well, we don't let him do a baptism. Fine. So we get to September 24th, 2015, and I've got every camera, every news organization in the world in my office. Here I am, Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, Catholic university, altar boy, standing there waiting for the Pope. Hell, I got tears running down my face. I'm trying to suck it up, because they're going to do all these pictures. And so greet the Pope. They do all their pictures. I get them all out of the office. And we got to sit down or look up, and there are 7 cardinals and a Pope. I looked at my staff guy. I said, what the hell are we here for? And so we had a nice meeting with the Pope, and it begins to break up, and my family's in this adjoining room, so they start to come in. So the Pope and I get up, and the Pope looks at my little guy, and he turns to his assistant and says, give me a glass of water. No, really? So I watch this guy go get this glass and get some water. He brings it back to the Pope. And the Pope takes it from him in his right hand. He put it in his left hand. Now I'm waiting for him to bless it. He just took a drink. The greatest head fake you have ever seen in your life. I was absolutely convinced he was going to baptize him right there on the spot. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, it literally took my breath away.
It was an almost Kodak minute.
So, almost. So we're getting ready to leave. There's this big departure ceremony, and a couple of 3 or 4 hours later, I spent all this time with the Pope. Pretty cool for a little older boy. And so they're trying to get everybody in position for the Pope's departure, and I put the Pope on my little elevator, what used to be an air shaft, down to the first floor, and I run down the old British staircase. So I meet the Pope on the first floor, and just the Pope and me. Not one other soul. They're all running around doing something, but just the Pope and me. And the Pope takes his left arm and grabs my left arm and pulls me next to him and starts saying the sweetest things that anybody's ever said to me. Well, you can imagine by this time, it's like a flood. And he's still holding on to me. He puts his right arm around me, gives me this giant bear hug, and he says, Speaker, please pray for me. I said, who am I to pray for you? But I will. And I do. Unbeknownst to me, the next morning I decide, in the 25 years I was in Washington, I never saw members happier than they were that day. Democrats, Republicans, House members, Senate members. And I thought to myself, I was going to leave at the end of the year, 2015 anyway. I was going to announce it in November. I said, it's not going to get any better than it was yesterday. I'm out of here today. And I was. And I wouldn't change anything about how I left either.
Ladies and gentlemen, John Boehner.
No! Great. No, great. Thank you all.